So we have the pleasure of having Joanne Yoong, who is the founder of Research for Impact, and we have Carmen Auste, who is the Vice President for the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board. So welcome, Joanne, and welcome, Carmen. Really glad to have you over here. So what we'll do in the next few minutes is try to cover some of the key aspects of privacy intersecting with real world data. Right? So to begin with, and John, I'll come to you first. What is the level of awareness with patients around data privacy guidelines, especially with real world data collection practices?
Thanks, Nitin. Very happy to be here. As a researcher, again, I think we comment on what we observe from the patient point of view. And what we find is that patients generally express that they understand that there are concerns about data privacy, but the further nuances of data privacy, especially in a real world setting where it's not obvious that they might be being asked for data in ways that are new or different, is quite limited. So there's general concern about these guidelines and people are worried about it, but their level of understanding of the specifics, for example, around the scope of what data can be collected, what types of use that data might go to later on, or the use of repurposing for that data, what it can or cannot be used for, whether there are third-party consequences for the use of the data, whether or not they own data that may be generated by themselves, but actually does not come directly from themselves. All of these nuances and guidance around those nuances are not clear to patients. And then our understanding is that there is sometimes a fair amount of anxiety because the level of awareness is both high, but at the same time not specific, which can lead patients to either be overly concerned about participating in these studies or to actually participate in them without really knowing what they've signed up for. But again, as a researcher, we see this from the outside. I think, Carmen, we would be much more informed by your experience from the actual patient perspective.
Thank you, John. I agree with you that when individuals are involved in health research or clinical trials, because of the requirements and guidelines that have been put in place for ethical research, that they would be well informed in terms of their rights with regards data use, and as well that there are explanations given to them in terms of how this data that will be generated for them will be used, with whom it will be shared, how it will be housed, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, for patients who are not involved in research or in clinical trials, for the most part, and I think this is true not only in my country, but in other low-middle income countries, there is a very low level of awareness. In our country, for the past 12 years, we even have passed a very comprehensive data privacy law, and we even have set up a monitoring organization just to ensure compliance as well as adherence to the provisions of the law. But unfortunately, when you go down to the field and you talk to patients, this is not something that is top of their mind or in their highest level of awareness and consciousness. So I think that's where the gap is right now. Over to you, Nitin.
Thanks, Carmen, and thanks, Joanne, as well. And yes, I think from the data privacy side of things as well, we do see awareness as one of the key challenges that we need to work on, especially with respect to patients. So with that, maybe as the initial context, and this question goes to both of you, Joanne and Carmen, what are some of the common pitfalls that you have seen put personal data at risk? Again, we're talking about real world data over here. So what's your take on that?
I think that's a really good question, Nitin, and I think my response is that the answer to that has changed very rapidly.
I know.
So in the last 15 years or so, I think we've seen some analyses of how healthcare data breaches take place. And there's three things I really want to point out. Firstly, that healthcare data, for all of the reasons you mentioned, is hugely valuable. And real world data is hugely valuable because it allows us to do so many more things and link to other data sources. For that reason, it's also not just valuable to patients and providers, but third-party stakeholders as well with more malicious intent. So what we're seeing from the data is that healthcare data breaches are exponentially increasing in the last 5 years, that this is much higher than other areas such as education and government, and also that the type of data breach has shifted. And so we're seeing much less of things like inappropriate disclosure or loss of data, and very much more of hacking or deliberate IT losses. So in actual fact, what we're seeing today is a shift away from losing data or having data breach because our we don't have the right information or we're not paying enough attention, but really that we have to be aware that now a lot of the pitfalls that take place are because we live in a situation where data is under attack, and almost all of these major data breaches are because of that today. Carmen?
Yeah, I agree 2000% with Joanne that even while the ability to gather and consolidate and harness data for positive use has grown, unfortunately, the darker side has grown as well. In fact, in the Philippines, one of the latest organizations that was hacked was our PhilHealth, which is the social health insurance, where all of the medical records and information of a large part of our population is housed. So I think what's very important is for organizations that are supposed to be, as Nitin said, guardians of data, to be able to put in place stronger systems so that they're able to really safeguard against all types of data breaches, whether it is intentional, malicious, or accidental. And at the same time as well, aside from the data security measures, there has to be specific policies and systems in terms of being able to ensure that the storage and the warehousing of this data, again, are safe, secure, and replaceable in the event of any humanitarian or disaster that may strike, which is very true for many countries in Asia Pacific. As you know, the Philippines is in the Ring of Fire, so for not having a typhoon, we have an earthquake or so on, but this is true for other countries. And most often we forget that we should not only safeguard it from human interventions, but as well from these natural events as well.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think great points. I mean, yes, health data, real world health data, right, is very valuable, especially because the value it brings in the black market is of course very high, and that's where the malicious misuse of this data is a fairly prevalent kind of practice which is there, unfortunately. Moving on, right? We talked a bit about what entities can do, and we have multiple entities which are involved in this. So we have the hospitals, we have the pharma companies, we have research companies which are involved and deal with such personal data. So in your view, what are some of the things that they should or sometimes they should not do when it comes to collecting and sharing of such personal data?
So maybe again, I'll give an abstract and then turn on to Carmen for the real world view on the real world data issues. So my sense is that when we're talking about these stakeholders around the patient in the whole ecosystem, there's really three things that we want to sort of highlight. One is that the infrastructure or policy advocacy needs to happen with the resources of those organizations that are large enough, influential enough, and have the right insight and track record to make that happen. So there is a responsibility on the part of, for example, pharma companies and large healthcare institutions and policy organizations to make sure that that policy infrastructure keeps evolving and building up, and that advocacy keeps happening and being heard and translated into real change at a system level. At a practice level, I think what's very critical for us is to understand two things. One is that that whole atmosphere and environment about consent needs to be revisited in a patient-centric way to make sure that the best that we can do for patients is to help them understand what exactly it is that they're getting into in language that they can understand, and to also then around them create contingency plans that are practical, realistic, and can be implemented very firmly and strongly. One of the things I think which is really important is to admit that in this environment, failures will happen. So contingency plans and preparation are not nice to have. They are absolutely must have. So focusing our attention on both ends of that process, how to get patients in a safe and responsible way, but then also how to manage the inevitable failures in a very practical and realistic way. Those are the things that I would focus attention on. Carmen?
Yeah, again, we're in agreement in terms of the need for companies that are involved in gathering and generating data from patients and other stakeholders to ensure that they have very strong cyber security mechanisms that are in place, but also to be able to ensure that patients are very well informed of the rights that they have in terms of data, that they can actually refuse or object to have certain type of data shared, or they can refuse or object to be part of researches if they do not feel comfortable enough. Oftentimes, this is something that is not strongly shared with our
Mm.
patients who are involved in health research or clinical trials. But I think as well, together with the accountability of those who are gathering and storing data, would also be the responsibility of our patients in terms of doing simple things like using stronger passwords rather than 1234 or ABCD, or something that can very easily connected with you, like your birthday or your address, because we find that all over, even with key influentials, this still happens. And then alongside the stronger passwords will be as well not oversharing in social media. Oftentimes the breaches that happen actually starts when we tend to put in too much of our personal information, and sometimes even sensitive information, like which hospital did you go to for checkup, where do you bring your family for this and that. And then that then becomes an invitation for other people to be able to log into our accounts. And of course, what we always say is to be very careful in terms of the attachments and the links that often you just see popping with all of the things, like you get a free gift or you get X thousands of dollars and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. In countries like ours, where people do not have the money to be able to pay monthly fees, we often depend on free Wi-Fi. So again, we need to be able to share with our patients and even other stakeholders that the free Wi-Fi is not necessarily free. It may bring a lot more headache afterwards, because this is something that is now being used as well by unscrupulous individuals. So really, I see the guardian, the safeguarding of our data privacy as not something that can be done by one sector alone. It's really, as mentioned earlier, it's a whole of society or even a whole of nation, because it can happen anywhere, in airports, in hospitals, and so on. So I think there needs to be not just greater awareness, but greater vigilance as well, and making it easier for people to safeguard their data. Back to you.
No, absolutely, Carmen and Joanne. I think in the privacy world, we do talk about certain rights which patients generally do have, right? And these come from the legislation itself. So they have the right to know what data the entities are handling. They have the right to access this data. Sometimes they have the right to correct or even erase this data, right? So I think as practitioners, it would be our responsibility to keep encouraging the patients to be aware about these rights, also to help them understand how we exercise or how they are supposed to exercise these rights as well. On the other hand, we do have the entities who handle this data, and again, entities should have their own policies in place. They should understand how the laws are applicable and ensure that they have enough processes in house to make sure that they are compliant with these requirements as well. So I think in summary, what I can see that we have discussed so far is that patients, yes, they do have a general awareness of data privacy challenges, but sometimes we do see that they lack specific guidelines and nuances of use and ownership as well. uh, Real world data, as we saw, is very valuable, right? And making it a target for malicious hacking, deliberate attacks, and so on and so forth. So we do see challenges. However, at the same time, as patients and patient groups become aware about their rights, as well as entities which process this data become more vigilant and accountable, I think the likelihood of patients willing to be participative in real world data related matters or activities is going to get higher. What we see is that this will build trust within the various players in the ecosystem, and this will help eventually bring better therapies to patients and also to help the shape the overall policy around these therapies as well. So Carmen, Joanne, thank you so much for your great insights. With this, I'll hand it over to the small poll that will shortly come on your screen. I would request you to take that small poll. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Adam Chi, Professor of SOSV Hawke School of Public Health, National University of Singapore, who will open the segment on future readiness. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you, Nitin.